A Mirror for Witches. Chapter 2. 1. There is a small smell of witchcraft in and about Boston. A straw doll, taken to meeting, throws many into confusion. In the fall of 1665, 2 were hanged in Boston for the bedevilment of an elderly woman, her cousin Germaine, and her swine. In that same year, Mr. Saul Peterham, a godly, decent man, refused some small rotten apples to an ancient and malicious hag. For this the old crone muttered at him, making an evil sign by her thumb and her nose, and took herself off in great bad humour. Mr. Peterham, on returning to his house, found that his wife, an estimable churchwoman, had fallen from a ladder she had put to the loft for the purpose of observing the conduct of her servant wench and the indentured male servant, the exact moment the crone had made her evil sign. The elders of the church had at the old woman and forced her, weeping and on her knees, to forswear the devil, his imps, and his ways, and to continue more strictly in the ways of God. It being observed that she could both weep and say the Lord's Prayer, many believed the accusation of witchcraft to be a false one, such as is often launched against disagreeable and impotent old women. By spring there was yet another suspicion of witchcraft in the Bay Colony, and this at Cowan Corners. In a hut close by the seashore, and in great misery, lived an old pauper called Green and his wife. He was a tinker, but there were better tinkers than he, and he got little work to do. His wife was a proud woman, born in Kent, of high rank, yet by turn of fortune she was so reduced as to have become the wife of a tinker. Her craft in herbs got her some money and more ill fame, nor was she content to raise and sell the honest herbs of England, but she must continually associate herself with the heathen tawny savages and thus learn arts, doubtless often evil arts, from them. The Indians venerated her, calling her White Mother and Moon Woman. She even went into the great forest with more safety than any man. She was loving towards these people, and had much traffic with them, in spite of the fact that the church elders had warned her twice, saying it is better for a woman to keep her own house than to go abroad through the woods alone, and no one knew on what errand. One Sabbath, in the midst of the house of the Lord, a poppet contrived of straw and maize, with a leather head and a grinning face on it, fell from below her skirts. None at the moment questioned her boldly as to what purpose she contrived this poppet, yet all thought of those dollies witches make, but to destroy again, that their enemies may dwindle with the dwindling dolly. Later in the week 3 deacons called upon her and demanded explanation. She was distraught, cried out upon them in anger because of their suspicions, and said she had but made a toy for Bilby's poor little doll, who, she said, was beaten and cruelly used by that shrew Hannah. The incident was then dismissed, except for a public reprimand for a woman so depraved as to put into the hand of a child a toy upon the Lord's day, and in the Lord's house. After this the Greens lost what friends they had, and no one came commonly to their hut upon the salt marsh but Bilby's wicked doll. On a February night, Hannah Bilby woke, overcome with retching and vomiting. In the morning Mr. Cleaver, the surgeon being called, took away 2 ounces of blood from the forearm. Still she continued in wretched state 3 days. By the oppression on her chest, and especially because of certain night sweatings and terrors, she became convinced that she was bewitched, and frankly accused Goodwife Green. Mr. Zelly roughly bade her hold her tongue, this being but one of many times when he befriended a witch, and declared there was no reason why Green should wish her harm. At which statement many were amazed, for they thought everyone knew that Green loved the little doll, and hated the foster mother because of her cruelty. Through all the clustering villages, Salem, Ipswich, Cowan Corners, etc., it was whispered how Doll had surrendered to Green either parings from Mrs. Hannah's nails or hair from her body, and had thus given Green the wherewithal to work magic. Within a year all suspicion seemed to have passed from Goody Green, but in 100 ways more doubts gathered about the child, and she was whispered of. Mrs. Bilby told many, here one and there two, usually with entreaties for prayers and commands for secrecy, that the girl was born and bred a witch. She told how her own unborn son, that thumping boy, had been blasted. She told them to watch. Was not Mr. Bilby himself bewitched by her? So it seemed to many. There were no clothes fine enough in Boston for his dear doll. He needs must send to England for them. Sometimes he held her on his knee, and she a girl of 13 or 14. Even when the elders and the minister came to call on him, and Hannah, as befitted her gender, withdrew from the room, Bilby would keep his ridiculous hobgoblin squatting at his feet. As he talked, he petted her shaggy, spiky hair. The child had nothing to do with children of her own age, nor did godly parents wish their children to play with her. For the most part she was a silent thing, stealing about on feet as quiet as cat's paws. To her foster father she was pretty and frolicsome. To Goodwife Green she was loving, and stole from the Bilby larder food for the wretched paupers. With her mouth she said little to anyone, but her eyes spoke, those round button eyes, and they spoke secret and evil things. 2 monstrous facts regarding Doll's earliest youth, which Mr. Zelly repeated almost 20 years after her death: how she attended Black Sabbath, etc., how she saw the devil in Brittany and probably swore to serve him, etc. When the time came, late in his life, that Mr. Zelly, being old and broken, was accused of witchcraft, he told, after long questionings, much that he knew about Bilby's doll. For instance, he said she never forgot one of those wicked things which she had learned of her parents in Brittany. It is true, the shock and horror of their death caused such mental anguish it seemed to her a black curtain, much like the smoke of that holocaust, dropped down upon her life. All that was actual in her life was before the curtain, that is, after her parents' death, yet all that lay behind this curtain did exist for her, only infinitely small and infinitely far away. To see, for she did not call it remembering, what lay behind this barrier, she had to think and think only of blackness. Soon was her industry rewarded. Behold, the blackness disintegrated, and little by little she saw strange scenes in piercing clarity, yet all in miniature. She saw these visions as though she were above them, say from the height of a church steeple, and she saw her own self, a little shaggy girl, walking below. If no one disturbed her, if Mrs. Hannah did not cuff her for idleness, she could watch the movements of these people for hours. Other witches and warlocks, phantom beasts, fiends, imps, goblins, fairies, and always her own self. Sometimes these people and creatures grew so small they were scarcely more than shifting sands. Yet the smaller they grew, the more intense was their actuality. Mr. Zelly said that she observed that when these images, visions, or what you will, were presented to her almost as large as life, they were vapory and hard to see. But when they were no larger than a grain of sand, she could see everything. The little frown on her father's forehead, the scales on the imp's shoulders, her mother's teeth as she smiled, even the nails on the hands of her own self. Yet how small must have been those hands when the whole body of an adult was no more than a grain of sand. Mr. Zelly, an old and broken man, was commanded to tell further. What would she see? On what business would these folk be about? She would see naked men and women with goats' horns on their heads. They danced back to back. As they danced, they cried, "Ho, ho, hara, ho," in the manner of witch people. she would see the sacrifice of a black kid and the crucifixion of the sacred wafer. Did she ever see the devil himself? Which people often select one of themselves to be, as it were, high priest in their infernal synagogue. Him they called Devil, such a one she often saw. He was young and lusty and dressed in green leaves. When they danced their sarabands, no one jumped as high as he. He was a pretty man, and women loved him. It was only on Black Sabbath he had such power over men and women. At other times he was a cordwainer. This devil that she saw was but a mock devil. Did she never see that scriptural devil, that foul fiend Lucifer? Ah, that she could never quite recall, not even with the powerful help of her strange, minute images. It is true that after hours of application she would sometimes see a woman, who she knew to be her mother, walking through great oak woods, mistletoe infested, and with her, clinging to her skirts, was a child. The child was her own self. A great light pierced the green gloom of the forest, and where it fell stood a man. He was an aristocrat, carried a small rapier with the hilt of which he toyed. He was dressed in green velvet, had a handsome, ruddy face, and loving blue eyes. Nor had he horns, she said, and if a tail, he kept it to himself. But his shoes, she noticed, were unsightly, as though contrived to accommodate clubbed foot or cloven hoof. To him her mother knelt, and the child knelt also. The mother said she had a little servant for him, who she promised would obey him in all things.
What shall I do with so little a one?
But he caressed her with his hands. His touch was cold as ice. Even to remember that touch raised the goose flesh upon her. It was searing as the hands of death. She never saw this particular scene enacted before her without experiencing a physical shock, pleasant and yet repellent. Then she could see the child accept the book the man offered her, and she always made a mark in the book with blood drawn from her own arm. But the end of this particular and much-loved vision was always the same and always disappointing, for she saw herself and her mother sitting by the hearth. Her mother was stirring the pot, and as she stirred she talked, telling the story of a little girl who had walked with her mother in a great wood, had met the devil, and had sworn to serve him. So it was, Doll Bilby never could be sure whether or not she had actually promised to serve the foul fiend and had made her blood mark in his book, or whether it was but a tale told by her mother. At first she felt no terror of the strange fantasies which, waking and sleeping, were always before her eyes, but as she grew to young womanhood, this uncertainty as to her true status came greatly to worry her. If she had indeed signed the book of hell, then she was utterly damned, and there was no hope for her. If she had not, then might she, by prayer, watchfulness, etc., escape into paradise? Thus she endured great anguish of spirit. At last the soul, which ever turns and struggles in the heart of man, turned uneasily within her, and she tried to forget all the evil which she remembered, even the voice of her mother, crying out piteously to her from the midst of flame. Then conscience, that gift from God to man, raised its head, and she lay and moaned upon her bed, listening to the holy voice of conscience, asking her over and over, to her utter weariness, "What have you done? What have you done? What have you done?" So she applied herself with burning intensity to the ways of religion. And it was then, said Mr. Zelly, he first came to ponder upon her, although she told him nothing of herself or of her past until some years later. But all her pious exercises were performed without that pleasure which the good Christian habitually manifests, but rather the terror of a lost soul. Mr. Zelly kept a diary, and in that diary he wrote, Doll being at that time in her 16th or even possibly in her 17th year, a wanton suggestion. Quote, I mark with interest the religious fluctuations of Miss D.B., but fear she fruits without roots, and but let a man, perhaps, Titus Thumb, come into her life by the door, and then shall God but pass out by the window. And more light and blasphemous talk, suggesting slyly that there may be some resemblance between the carnal love of body and the spirit love of soul. 3. A good young man is taken in a witch's net. This Titus Thumb, to whom Mr. Zelli referred, was the oldest child and only son of Deacon Ephraim Thumb, whose lands lay south of and adjoining to the lands of Mr. Bilby. There had always been intimacy between the two farms, for the men of one helped the men of the other at harvesting, planting, and building. The two women were gossips, the two men were cronies. Titus had been much away because he was a scholar at the new college in Cambridge. For 1 year he was home again to help in the opening up of certain new lands. He was a studious youth who hoped in time to prepare himself for the ministry of God. This, however, never came to pass, for God willed otherwise, and on completing his studies at Cambridge, he remained there, known to hundreds of young Latinists as Tutor Thumb. He was a young man of special parts and handsome person. He would be a minister, and his father was rich. The wenches of the village flocked to him like moths to a flame, ignoring often, in the exuberance of the chase, for they were unmannerly and bold to him, proper female conduct. They mocked him among themselves, saying that he was his mother's darling or cosset, that he would never seek out a woman for himself, pulling him behind doors and kissing him, pushing their bodies against him when he could not escape them, etc., for which wanton conduct they were well served, for he would have none of them, and, keeping the 5th commandment well in mind, stayed close to his parents' house. He had 2 younger sisters, born at one time, for they were twins. They were sad and puny children, and many who saw them wondered that God had seen fit to cut his cloth so close. That is, it seemed to many that he had but enough material, brains, bones, spirits, hair, vitals, etc., to make one proper child, yet out of this little he had made 2. In answer to this questioning of divine wisdom, Mr. Zelli said no one body could have endured as many diseases and ills as the Thumb twins were heir to. Perhaps it was as well to divide up the maladies as well as the strength. Labor had a falling sickness. She would stiffen with a horrid din, foam, and go into convulsions. Nor was sorrow of much hardier stock. She was subject to nightmares and other delusions, which Mr. Cleaver insisted arose from a cold stomach. Their mother vexed herself greatly over them, and where another woman might think it well if the miserable things but made a good end and returned early to that God who had sent them thus poorly fortified into the world, she was always calling upon Mr. Cleaver or Goody Green to dose them, or Mr. Zelli to pray over them. They were pretty children, with soft brown eyes and yellow hair, fine and finicky, but their limbs were miserably thin, and their bellies somewhat swollen. Mrs. Thumb told them not to play with Bilby's doll. She feared the girl because her foster mother said she was a witch. Like most sickly children, they were poorly trained in obedience. They met Bilby's doll whenever they could, by the willow brook which separated the 2 farms. Of these meetings, however, they said little or nothing. The mother often heard them whispering and laughing to each other, and, because she would hear them talk of Mistress Dolly, she knew they saw her. As they were too feeble to be whipped or even shaken, she had little control over them. She would have been vexed to know that often her husband, sitting at the Black Moon Tavern with Mr. Bilby, planned that in due time this same girl, whom Mrs. Thumb considered too dangerous even to cast an eye upon the twins, should marry the handsome Titus. On such occasions Mr. Bilby, although he would clap himself on the back and protest his friendship, always put him off. Doll was but a child, not old enough to marry. She had the immature body of a girl of 12. Give her time and she would grow. Deacon Thumb would not be put off. Was she not 16 at the youngest? Had not his own mother married before that? He was most cupidous. He wanted his son to become heir to the fine estate of Bilby. He did not heed what his wife said of danger. He cared more that his son should have a great property in this world than that his soul should be saved for the next. He was not an evil man, for he was a deacon in the church. He was a heedless man, and too easily dismissed as gossip the true stories his wife forever whispered in his ear in regard to this same doll. Mrs. Bilby was anxious that the girl should marry and so be out of the house. One day she said, "What shall we ever do with your doll? There's not a man in town that would marry her." Mr. Bilby said that every unmarried man in the town would be glad to get her. Mrs. Bilby said, "You mean they would be glad to get a slice off your meadows." He said he would box her ears for her. She said Doll would be lucky if she got herself a vagabond, or a widowed man, or an old man of 80. Mr. Bilby boxed her ears and went down to the tavern. Then he told Deacon Thumb that, although it broke his heart even to think of parting with his treasure, yet was marriage the one and only proper state for woman, and he would put her happiness even before his own. Moreover, his wife still hated the girl, even more than she had the night she first saw her. And although a good woman, and very handsome, yet she was hard. He said he had just boxed her ears and suggested that he was now willing to talk of the marriage settlement. He would do something very handsome by Doll, for God knows, he said, she is dear to me. For, in spite of the warnings of his better nature, a young man looks covetously to Bilby's doll. On certain days, the men of the two farms combined their labors. Then Doll brought to her foster father his midday dinner. To suit his fancy, she would bring food for herself also. This food she would eat quickly and without speaking to anyone, keeping close to Mr. Bilby. On those harvest days, when the sun was bright on the stubble and heat shimmered in the air, the shade beneath the oaks was grateful. Doll Bilby, in the bright dresses her foster father bought for her, looked as fresh within this shade as one of those little summer flowers that go down before the scythes of harvesters. This Titus noticed, and he knew, although never a word had been spoken to him, that his father wished the match, and his mother opposed it. Also he noticed that the young woman, although so small, was made in a neat and most pleasing manner. She was more dainty, more finicky in her cut than the big English girls. He often thought, as he stretched himself to rest upon the earth, that to the eye of a man of rare discernment, such delicacy and small perfection might give more pleasure than more opulent charms. Yet he never went so far as to say that he himself was that discerning man. Likewise it pleased him that she was shy before him, for he had been over-courted. When he would stretch his body along the ground, close to where she sat, she would gaze unsmilingly at him out of her wild, troubled eyes, and something in that gaze, some necromancy, stirred his blood, so that at nights he felt desire for her, and often dreamed impossible things of her. During all that year of harvest he had no thought for another one, but only of Bilby's wicked doll. He knew the stories of her, for his mother was forever at his elbow whispering things. He knew of her foreign birth, how she had once blasted an unborn child, how she and Goody Green had afflicted Mrs. Bilby some years ago, making her vomit pins and fur. for to such proportions had the story of the woman's illness already grown, and he could see for himself how she bewitched her foster father out of his 7 senses. As he gazed upon her, sometimes the marrow grew cold in his bones. He thought if he were a wise and Christian man, he would have none of her in spite of his own father's cupidity. In his heart he, like his mother, feared her. He could not understand the power she, without effort, had over him, for the very sight of her coming across the hot fields of noon threw him into a cold, dismal, unnatural sweat. Now was his heart set towards this marriage, but he looked with dread, as well as joy, to that day which should unite her to him. He believed that whatever her secret might be, she should deliver it up to him on her bridal. Half he was persuaded that he would find that she, like Sarah in the book of Tobit, had a demon lover, who would strangle any bridegroom, nor had he an angel or a fish's liver with which to protect himself. 5. A malignant black bull leads all astray. Young Thumb fears Doll and suspects the creature as her familiar. The Thumbs had a young black bull, which, with other neat cattle and quick stock, they had out from England on the ship Fawnley. This bull was a wanderer, breaking stout fences, and seeking out his own pleasure among his neighbours' cornfields, cabbage plots, and herds. On the last day of April, Ahab, the bull, loosed himself, and climbing a high hedge of stumps, which looked strong enough to hold any creature but an angel from heaven, he set forth. Having crossed many pastures, and trampled down valuable rye, he came to the banks of the river Inch, where it formed the northern boundary of the Bilby farm. The men were far away burning brush. Mrs. Bilby was at her churn in the milk-house. Doll, a shiftless wench, was loitering by the river's edge, and there she came across the bull. He was knee-deep among the cowslips. Seeing her, he threatened playfully with his short horns, and set off as fast as he could trot, with a bunch of yellow flowers dangling from his blue lips. She knew the animal to be of great value, and that she must quickly give warning of his liberty lest he escape into the forest, and being set upon by savages of the faire nature of the place, become but meat in the stomachs of those little schooled to appreciate his worth. She ran quickly back to the house, calling that Black Ahab was loose, and she had seen him head for the forest. Mrs. Hannah, rushing from the milk-house, caught the girl by the arm, shook her angrily because the cows were up and ready for milking, and she was late for her work. She would not let her run to the upland fields where the men burned brush, nor to the Thumbs' farm so that the creature might be caught. She flung her milking stool and her pail at her feet, and told her to be about her own business, for if she had done as she should have done, that is, if she had made cheese all afternoon, instead of loitering about the pastures, she never would have seen Ahab or known that he had escaped. Doll sat upon her stool and bent herself silently to her work. On his return in the evening, Mr. Bilby was angry to find that no word had been sent to his neighbor in regard to the loss of his creature, nor did Doll tell him that it was his wife's and not her fault, partly because she was ashamed that he thought her responsible for the loss, and partly because she was a wild girl who loved to run about. She joined the searching party, made up of the men of the 2 households. They searched the pastures and the ploughed lands, the fields, the meadows. There was no place else to search but the forest, for Ahab was utterly gone. They searched the forest until it was black night, following the snappings of twigs, blowings, stampings. Not once did they see the body of the black bull. Doll kept to her foster father's heels. Her dress and hands were torn, her feet soaked with wet. She often called, and in a lovely voice, "Ahab! Ahab!" As often as she cried, Titus knew her whereabouts, and took himself to her side. For on that black night it was she and not the mischievous bull that he was pursuing. He thought how heavy was the night, how awful in their majesty the woods, and how wild and small the dark goblin child. So he prayed at the same moment that God might deliver his soul from her soul, and her body unto his. Weary and disheartened at last, all turned towards home. But Doll had lost Mr. Bilby, who had started back with Deacon Thumb. Titus, amazed and delighted to find her alone, walked by her side. Doll bitterly reproached herself that she had not given warning in time. To comfort her, Titus said it was only his and his father's fault because they could not keep the beast in bonds. To his amazement, he found that it was not with their loss she was concerned, but only with the fortunes or misfortunes of the wretched bull. He thought, "Has this woman a familiar? And is it that cursed Ahab?" So his marrow froze in his bones, thinking that she was indeed no bigger than one of those little goblins that live by the hob and bring good fortune to those who are kind to them, and also how there was much about her shape to please a man of rare discernment. He would have touched her with his hands, witch or no witch, and supported her weariness through the rough, dark pasture lands. If she would accept this much from him, it was possible, for the night was May night, when all young men for hundreds of years have been allowed special license from their sweethearts. She would permit more and more, so that the day's vexations might end joyously. Many times he had felt a vital spark pass from her to him, and he could not but believe that she was conspicuous of it as well as he. Doll seemed not to realize his intent. As in the dark he approached his hands to her, she floated from him. Before her home was reached, he came to fancy she had no body, or that by some charm, strong as that charm she had worked to bind him to her, she had now made a barrier about herself which he had not the physical strength to break. He thought of Sarah and her loving demon, Asmodeus, and wondered if such a fiend might now be protecting her. And he wished he had never heard that holy story, for Sarah, according to sacred writ, had 7 husbands, and each young man in turn had been strangled upon his marriage bed by the fiend Asmodeus, who loved her. 6. A young Christian witnesses an awful metamorphosis and shoots a bullet, but not a silver bullet. The young man's bodily fatigue was great, and his soul tormented. It grieved him to think that when at last he had gotten Doll Bilby by herself, and that upon a May night, it had profited him nothing. That night he could not sleep, but lay hot and lustful upon his bed. When he believed day about to dawn, he got himself into breeches, jerkin, hose, and shoes, and, having drunk a droghin of ale, he went again to the search of Ahab. Because there might be danger in the forest, he took with him his bastard musket. He came out of the house. It was not yet day. There was some light from the east, but it was a specious and unreal light, and the mists and fog from over the sea were heavy and blue. He misliked the day. First he looked about his own cow-pens, and then about the cow-pens of his neighbor, for he knew the creature loved the company of his own kind, and, if alive, would be like to return to them. There was neither bull nor sign of bull. With his musket upon his shoulder, he took a path through Mr. Bilby's meadows, and came down to the smooth waters of the river Inch. He thought, "This Ahab is a greedy drinker. As soon as the sun is up, he will get to the river and gorge himself with water." The fogs lay heaviest over the river, and they lay flat and white, like piled counterpanes. Steadily the watery light grew from the east. He thought he would sit upon a boulder under a willow tree. The sun would soon shine out and drink up the fogs and dews of night. He kept his bastard musket on his knees, partly because the strangeness of the twilight vexed him, and partly because he knew that not far from him, no further than he could shoot with his gun, was a path from out of the woods down which wild animals often came early to drink from the river. It was down this path he hoped to see Ahab, and in the meantime he might get venison for his mother's larder. He sat quietly, and a doe stepped out, followed by twin fawns. But these he would not shoot, for their grace and smallness reminded him of Doll. Everything reminded him of Doll, the birds that sang, the flowers and the grasses, even the mystery and silence of the dawn. Yet these things should not have reminded him of a woman, but of her maker. In time he heard a crashing and breaking of twigs, and laughed to himself that he had read the bull's thoughts so well, for nothing that lived in the forest would make such a commotion. Only a domestic barnyard animal would carry himself so noisily. Nor was he disappointed, for out of the fogs and through the brush came the young bull, looking vast and large in the unreal light of dawn. He thought to let the creature settle himself to his drinking, and then to steal up from behind him and catch his halter. So he sat quietly, until he saw with astonishment that what he believed to be an Indian was astride him, and having rigged reins to the halter, was endeavoring to turn him from the water. To see a rider on Ahab did not surprise him, for he knew the bull had often carried even his little sisters, the puny labor and sorrow. It did astonish and anger him to see a savage in possession of his father's property, so he called out roughly and forbade the man to turn the creature away from him. What next happened, he never truly knew, for he was sure that the tawny, which at the instant seemed a large and ferocious brave, jumped from the bull's back and made at him with his tomahawk. Titus knelt upon one knee and fired. In spite of the fogs and bushes that partly confused his sight, he took his aim most accurately against a bit of beadwork above the heart of his enemy. Now he saw this boy or man most clearly, the deerskin fringe to his jerkin, the feathers, the dark angry face, the tomahawk, the patterns made by the beads, and he knew that his aim was accurate and good. Yet, even as the bullet sped to its mark, the Indian was there no more, and instead stood Doll Bilby, with her hands clasped to her heart. He knew the bullet went through her. When he first saw her, she was still staggering from the impact, but when he reached her side and pulled away her hands, crying out and lamenting he had killed her, there was no mark of blood upon her gray gown, and she assured him in a weak and frightened voice that she was unhurt. This gown that Doll had on that day was made of strong fustian, and as Mrs. Hannah always said, it had not a hole nor tear in it. Yet the next time Doll wore it, there was discovered above the heart a minute and perfect patch, put on evidently to cover a hole no larger than a sixpence. So great and so unreasonable was Titus's love for Doll, he at first hardly considered the awful metamorphosis he had witnessed. Instead, he was sick to think how close she had been to death. As this story, which has just been set down in its true form, spread through the village, it grew incredibly larger in the mouths of certain people, and yet in the mouths of others it dwindled down to nothing. For the former of these insisted that Doll did not come alone, but was escorted by a vast troop of infernals, witches, etc., and that Ahab spoke to his master, making sundry infantile observations, such as might occur to the intelligence of a beast. Those who would make nothing of the story, and among these was Mr. Zelly, said Titus was no solid rock upon which to build the truth, and that his fancy had ridden him. There never had been an Indian upon the bull's back, only Doll. He never had seen the beads, fringes, tomahawk. When he shot, his aim was confused, and he had gone wide the mark. Mr. Zelly, in his diary, quotes scripture in regard to this curious incident, saying in part that our Lord warns us against the putting of new wine into old bottles, lest the new wine prove too strong and burst the bottles. Quote, so a torrent of feeling, especially when arising from the passions, is of the greatest danger to a weak container, and young Mr. Thumb is that weak container. At that moment, however, Titus had but one thought, and that was at last the wench was in his arms, for she was so weakened by fear, or perhaps from the actual shock of the bullet, she could hardly stand. He comforted her, stroking her hair, kissing her, and saying over and over that he would have died rather than hurt a hair of her head. Concerning the fact that but a second before she had been in other shape, and enjoying a different gender, he said nothing, for he thought that she might wish to remain mute concerning the matter. And then he thought, it was because of kindness, at least if not towards me, towards the bull, that made this modest young female assume another shape. How could she, as a white girl, have ventured to the forest and found Ahab? So he said nothing. Now that at last his arms were about her, he felt none of the fire and anguish he had endured the night before. Rather, it seemed to him that he was caressing and comforting one of his own sisters. So he set her sideways on the bull and took her to her own house. By the time he had reached his father's farm, he was once more swept by such inordinate and passionate desire. He could not believe that earlier in the same morning he had kissed and comforted her, thinking her only a child, not even a witch, and much less a woman.